to the installations we have here at Argonne. And so I'm going to give you the theory of this right now, and then later in the afternoon session, I'm more than happy to sit down and work with you to get set up and going on these resources here. I've got some slides that I'll just save for this afternoon session, which just have exercises, just going through the process of connecting and using ParaView on these clusters here. So first, Joe and Hank took away all my material, so I had to insert some new slides about what Kitware is and what ParaView is, just to give you a background where we're coming from. And then, but mostly in this first session, so what I'm going to talk here today is just about how ParaView works on big systems and what it's for, what the principles are behind it, and an introduction to how to start using it. Okay. Again, in the afternoon session, or sorry, the evening session, I can sit down with you and we can go through these exercises of getting set up and actually running and do some visualization on these resources here. So first, a lot of people, it turns out, don't know what Kitware is. Kitware is a small company, started in '98. We have about 100 employees located. The main office is in Albany, New York. We have offices now in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Lyon, France. And what we do is we're a collaborative open source company. So we produce and write software, open source software, and then we try to foster communities around these software tools and foster communities and collaborations whereby we extend the tools and use them for new purposes and work into new domains. I said we're about 100 employees, a little more than that. Our main focuses, I'll talk about just briefly, are HPC, scientific computing, medical computing, computer vision, and software process, with more and more foray into data and analytics. What our most important product, our most widely used product is CMake. Again, we're not the only developers of any of these tools, but we're the primary developers, and we manage the repositories and manage the collaborative environments that keeps them growing with contributions from anyone we can get to contribute to these products. So we are the primary developers of CMake, ParaView, and VTK, but we're not the only one. So our software process group, it grew out of the whole company is an offshoot of GE Research in Schenectady, New York. And what the software process group does, they're mostly known for CMake and C-. So all of our tools have the same software process lifecycle with fast development and rapid testing every night on a variety of platforms. And CMake is the tool that you may have known about. It is more or less a twin of the AutoConf tools. Has a slightly, I think, easier to read syntax than AutoConf tools. It has a little bit better support for platform independence, but overall they have more or less the same feature set between the two tools. The Auto tools and CMake are more or less have the same purpose. You use these to make systems where your software will compile and run on anything you have at your disposal. By headcount, the largest portion of the company is the computer vision department. This is an entirely new division of Kitware. And they are doing the opposite of scientific visualization. Rather than having computers generate images, they're sending images into computers and then figuring out what's going on inside them. So just after Anthony Hooks joined Kitware from GE, the first project they worked on was taking video footage of American Football League games and then having the computer recognize what the patterns were, what plays were being made, and so forth. And so now they're doing much more less fun things than that with drones and so forth, figuring out what patterns are going on within large amounts of footage. So they say, give me all instances within these terabytes of data when 3 trucks meet and then a green truck leaves. You can give that type of query to the software systems these guys are making, and the computer will figure it out and highlight and return all the video segments that match that criteria. In the slightly less evil side of the company is the medical computing group. These are the people behind ITK, Slicer, and so forth. They do things like help doctors and companies design implants for patients based on the patient's own anatomy. They do things like help design phantoms that can be placed within a scanner to calibrate the MRI and CT scanners that take images of the patients, so you get a much better understanding of what the voxels actually mean in the data you get back. And of course, the group I work for is the scientific computing group, and we do HPC and visualization. Our two major tools that you know of are VTK, which is the visualization toolkit, and ParaView. So what is ParaView? In one sentence, I describe it as an application and architecture for the display and analysis of massive scientific data sets. So in other words, it is a twin of Visit from a parallel universe. Okay? They have very similar structure behind them. Very similar groups have started, open source groups have started the development of these and collaborate on them. I'll leave it up to you to decide which group is actually evil, but I'll point out that Hank actually has the goatee. I mean, it's an application, so just like Visit or Nsight or TechPlot or anything like that, it's a tool which you just open up the application and then you can ingest your data set and start looking at and analyzing your data. You don't have to program anything to look at your data, ideally, unlike VTK, which is the visualization toolkit, which you have to write programs out of to do the exact same thing. It is an architecture. This is more the strength of ParaView, the configurability and the reuse of the architecture behind it, as opposed to Visit. It's an architecture. We like to make things that are open source and that will grow. We're trying to foster these collaborative environments where people will contribute to the code and we can pursue new directions for the software. So it's an architecture that you can reuse to customize. You can customize the architecture in ParaView fairly easily since about ParaView 3.6 when we introduced the branding architecture, whereby you can replace the GUI with your own stripped down versions of the GUI, and we use that quite a bit in Kitware for custom clients. They'll come to us and say, we want a version of this which is good for looking at traffic data. And so they don't care anything about streamlines or such things like that, or the Python programmability of it. They just want to see the data in large amounts of data, customized for just displaying maps. Okay? So we'll reuse the architecture at Kitware quite frequently, and people outside of Kitware also reuse the architecture to make their own applications which are based on ParaView's architecture, but customized to their domains. It is for the display. Its background is in qualitative visualization, making pretty pictures of your data, or otherwise known as colorful fluid dynamics. It comes for the display of data, but more and more since ParaView 3.0, we've been working more and more features of quantitative analysis into it. We can do plots, we can do statistical analysis, we can pick points and so forth, and dump out the data and export it to other tools. And of course, I'm here talking today based on the parallel nature of it. It's really meant for not just to be a turnkey application, but one, just like Visit, which is used for large, massive data sets. Okay, high resolution data sets primarily. ParaView has been around almost as long as Kitware. It started in 1999 as a collaboration between Jim Ahrens at Los Alamos National Lab and Kitware, and Jim had the goal of making VTK into an application, as I said, and making it scale. And since then, we've been contributing to VTK and ParaView and making it better and better at both of these goals. In 2005, Sandia, a national lab, jumped in with both feet, and they worked with Kitware and with a company called CSimSoft to make the next major generation of ParaView, replacing the TickleTK widget library with Qt, which at the time was only semi-open source, but we had an exception to use for it. But in any case, it looks a lot nicer since then, and all the other Viz tools have since followed and are also using Qt because Qt is great. And so the goals were to make it look better, make it easier to use, and to start adding these quantitative features to it, multi-view and quantitative features. We're continuing to evolve. We have a release schedule of roughly 3 months. In practice, it turns out to be more like 6 months. But we aim for every 3 months having either a new patch or minor release. And we just had ParaView 4.0 come out in June of this year. Before I get into focusing on the large data features of it, I'm going to talk about just describe what I see as the current directions ParaView is going in. ParaView 4.0 was really a restructuring of the source code to produce something called Catalyst, which is used for in situ in situ data processing, which both Joe and Hank have talked about somewhat. So what Catalyst is a stripped down version of the ParaView server, which is meant to be linked directly into the simulation codes so that you can produce visualizations of the data without ever touching the disk. Well, you still have to write out some files, but they're generally small files. You don't have to spend 10 minutes dumping the entire data. You can just spend a few microseconds spitting out an image. Another direction we're going in heavily is in web and mobile frontiers. We've on our third incarnation now of ParaView Web, which is a web-based front end to the ParaView server. The most recent version is, every version we've had has been both more capable and easier to build and configure. It comes directly within ParaView by default now. And so ParaView Web is, like I said, it's just a web-based interface to a ParaView server running somewhere with a JavaScript scripting library on top of it. We're also going into mobile. We have an alternative rendering front end for VTK called VES, and we built an application called Kiwi Viewer out of that, which is a scientific visualization application for mobile phones, basically iPads and mobile phones, that sort of thing. What we're just starting to work on now, thanks to a grant from the NIH, is replacing VTK's rendering libraries, either replacing or augmenting these rendering libraries, which were written roughly in late 1990s, to make it easier to do things like have rendering library independence and just better structuring, better performance, better looking things. So we're overhauling the rendering part of VTK, which hasn't really been touched in a long time. And we're just starting to work on that. And the other direction we're going into is SMP and GPGPU programming, which we've had the first foray in there was an interface to Los Alamos' Piston, GPGPU visualization libraries. The integration with Sandia's DAX toolkit and others are coming, and we're just starting to integrate some work from INRIA and EDF, which brings in multi-threaded processing for generic unstructured data filters. So these are the directions I see VTK and ParaView, and thus ParaView going in the future. Okay. So with that background, we're going to go back into the parallel VTK theory, really. So a lot of people, once they realize that para in ParaView means parallel, they think that if by just throwing more processors at the problem, they're going to have VTK or ParaView rendering faster, which is not the case in almost any situation. There are some data processing tasks, such as stream tracing and things like that, which can be computationally intensive. But in general, most things that you do in visualization are not computationally intensive. So throwing more processors at the problem does not get you any speed up. It just gets you limited by the depth compositing frame rate, which, as Hank said, is about 10 frames per second in practice. Okay, so as opposed to strong scaling, Amdahl's law, that's not what you're going to see. Throwing more processors at the problem is not going to make ParaView any faster. But if you have huge data, throwing more resources at the problem, including the memory and disk accesses, then you can approach feasibility for these large high-resolution data sets. So that's the Gustafson's law is what's behind both ParaView and Visit's architectures. So why you run them in parallel is not to make it faster, but just to make it possible to render extremely large data sets. These slides are very old now, produced in roughly 2005, 2006 or so. But these were generated at Sandia, the Glevka asteroid impaction data set. They were produced on a 256 node Linux cluster, which has since been decommissioned. But even back then, you could do, even back in 2006, 2007, you could do billions of cells, either unstructured or structured. My personal record is a 10 billion unstructured cell simulated data set, which I was rendering on a big Intel cluster at roughly 10 frames per second. So it's as Hank said, it actually does scale. So if you have large high-resolution problems, throw more memory chips at it, and it will be able to process them. Okay. So ParaView's structure is somewhat similar to Visit's. We have, in our case, three conceptual components, two of which are parallel. In the end, the back-end processing is identical pipelines, all of which process different portions of the data. So what Hank was saying about each of the server nodes in Visit processes different blocks, we do the exact same thing in our data server. Okay. We also have optionally a parallel render server in which the data is rendered in parallel. So the idea behind this was that if you have a situation like you have here where you have Mira and then the mini-me of Mira would be Tukey, you could run the data server portions on Mira and the rendering portions on Tukey and then control the whole thing from your client. It does work, but in practice, people have found that that's almost never useful to split it up that way. I'll talk more about that in a little while. So again, we have on the data server component, we have a parallel VTK pipeline in which each node in the processing cluster, each of the compute nodes runs an identical pipeline, all of which are working on a different data portion of the data that is being fed into a parallel rendering component. And then the composited images, or if the data is really small, just the surface data is sent to the client where you're interacting with it remotely. So with that conceptual architecture behind ParaView, I'll talk about the 4 different primary running modes that you might run ParaView in. So by default, when you run it, you're running what's called the serial or built-in, connected to the built-in server. So if you just download ParaView and run it on your local laptop, by default, it's going to run in this mode where the data processing, the render processing, and the client portions are all running within the same process. There are different versions of the client. There is the graphical user interface, which you'll see. There is the Python scripting, which we'll talk about. There are other ones such as the JavaScript interface and so forth. But in general, they all work the same way. They have the entire visualization pipeline is working within the same process within this built-in or serial mode. The next mode that you'll see most often is called the combined server mode, where we have a parallel MPI parallel process, which is running both the data server and render server components together in a process, all of which are feed into the results into the client where you control it from. So this is a very useful thing if you have moderate sized data. So it's totally feasible to connect this mode to Eureka or Tukey or even some of the larger clusters and then control them interactively. And this is sometimes very useful if you're just exploring the data. But in practice, if you have very large amounts of data, it's infeasible to interactively control the visualization because you just can't have 10,000 nodes or 100,000 nodes all sitting waiting for you to move the mouse. It's just a gross misuse of resources. So that brings us to the next mode, which is just pure batch processing. So here we have the same MPI parallel server side. And all of these, there is actually no client connected to these. These just run a Python interpreter within the same process. And all of the nodes in the data server portion process the same data and do whatever the Python script you've given it tells it to do. For very large data sets, this is the most feasible way to do the processing until Catalyst comes more and more online. Okay. And as I mentioned, the split server where you have a parallel job for the data processing and a parallel job for the rendering is possible, but in practice it's not useful because the cost of sending the visible geometry from the data processing nodes to the parallel rendering nodes, even though the rendering nodes have GPUs and can render that data faster, the cost of sending the data from the data server component to the render server component almost always outweighs the benefit of rendering it faster on the GPUs. So in practice, it's almost always always better to just compile in off-screen Mesa and do the rendering in the CPU rather than have the data sent to a GPU cluster. So with all that, as Hank talked about before, if you download Visit, you won't generally get a parallel copy of Visit. With ParaView, sometimes you get a parallel copy, and sometimes you don't, depending on what the different release managers are doing and what the different operating systems are doing. For instance, before Lion came out, Apple always included MPI within their operating system, so it was easy for us to link into MPI. But since Lion, we don't do that anymore. So we have, at Kitware, we have a pretty inconsistent history of whether or not we release MPI-enabled versions of ParaView that you can get from a download site. But even if when we do, the MPI we include is generally not the one you want to use on any given cluster you have at hand. We'll pick something like MPitch or OpenMPI because it's easy to package, but if you want to run MPI on your cluster, you should use the MPI which comes with your network card vendor gives you. So you want to use the right MPI that you have on your system, not the one we have. So all I'm saying here is that the ParaView you download from the Kitware, the ParaView download site is not generally MPI enabled, so don't trust it. Try not to use that. Instead, you should generally use it. You should generally compile ParaView with MPI enabled and use that instead. Okay. Other things you might want to do, you almost always want to enable Python. Python is an optional component within ParaView. If you don't turn it on, you won't get any scriptability, and some of the filtering and some of the rendering aspects now won't be available. But you can still do it without using Python. But we highly recommend you enable Python when you build your ParaView. So you build your own ParaView and turn on both MPI and Python to do almost any of these parallel features we'll talk about. So how do you go about getting that? The easiest way is just access a system like Argonne or Oak Ridge, where we're installing it now on the visualization clusters and the HPC machines. Some of the distributions, like Fedora, I think has a MPI version of ParaView that they release. So that would be another good alternative. If you have a Fedora cluster, just use the ParaView with MPI that you can get from the distribution. Or, as I recommend, build your own. And on our wiki site, there are a list of the installations that I know of where people have installed ParaView on their clusters with more and more of the access routines I'll talk about later. And also detailed instructions about how to build ParaView. Okay. One of the things you'll find on the ParaView wiki is a description of something called the super build. Like Hank said, there is a meta builder, so it will build visit and all of visit's dependencies. ParaView's terminology for that is a super build. It uses a relatively new feature in CMake to download dependencies and build them just the way you want. And since ParaView 4.0, our super build now has support for cross-compilation built in. So if you have to build ParaView on a Cray or especially on a Blue Gene, you should try the super build first because it's got all the right paths and things in there to configure it for these types of machines. So that comes to an interesting point. All of our scriptability comes from Python, but running Python on some of these HPC machines is not a trivial exercise. Until the Cray XC5, I think, there was no support for shared libraries at all, and Python is highly shared library dependent. But if you don't have, you can build ParaView without it. But if you don't, you don't get any of the scriptability features, and you can't generally build Python without shared libraries. On modern Crays, at least, they do have support for shared libraries. I think the Blue Gene Q does too. I'm not sure about that, but I think they do. But I don't recommend it yet. Instead, I think you should do what we do in the ParaView super build when we cross-compile, is that we CMakeify Python and then compile Python statically. This has some performance benefits to it, in that all of the routines you need are generally within the libraries. If you need to do this, I'd recommend you look at the ParaView super build, download that, and try it, and see how we CMakeify and then statically build Python and build it into ParaView. So in ParaView 4.0, we're going to have the concept of frozen Python, where all of the Python, not just the Python extension modules, not just the C implemented Python modules are built into the application, but all of the pure Python modules that you are likely to use in ParaView are also built into memory. They're stuffed into memory rather than disk, so that all of the processors on these high-performance computing machines don't have to hit the disk to do something like write an image or animate or something like that. So ParaView 4.0 is the first one where we're going to have frozen Python in it. It's this new feature which will prevent the situation where you have hundreds of thousands of nodes, all of which are hitting the disk to open up some simple Python module file, .py file. So what does Python scripting in ParaView look like? It's pretty simple. They're like Visit. We have two different flavors. The one I'll talk about is the one where we're controlling the client rather than the one that's running on the server side. If you're interested in the version where we have Python running on the server, look on the ParaView wiki for the Python programmable filter, or just try it out. It's a VTK algorithm which runs arbitrary Python code and fits within the pipeline. But in general, to use ParaView on HPC systems, you'll be doing client-side Python. So ParaView comes with several different executables. There is the one called ParaView, which starts up the Qt GUI that you're used to. There is also one called PV Server, which is the MPI parallel job for the combined server instance I talked about earlier. And there's one called PV Batch, which starts up an instance of the Python interpreter connected to the MPI parallel PV Server engine. And this is a script here. We start off PV Batch, and we tell it to import the modules from ParaView. And then we ask ParaView how many processors we're connected to right now. Then we create a VTK pipeline, an algorithm, a sphere source in this case. And then we control the parameters of the sphere source. We say, OK, make it a high-resolution sphere source rather than the one with just 16 facets that you get by default. And then we create a new VTK filter, a process ID scalars filter, which adds an attribute to all of the geometry and cells which denote which processor produced the pointer cells in question. And then we create a lookup table, and then we render it, and then we save the image to a file. And so with this simple script, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. It's 11 lines long. This is the script I use to test all of the Python installations, the ParaView installations I do on HPC clusters. So if I run this script and I get an image which shows me the sphere with lots of different colors in it, then I know the installation is working. Then I can script ParaView and I can do arbitrary things with it after that. So if you're not terribly familiar with Python or more likely with ParaView's modules on top of Python, you should know how to learn our version of Python. You can go to this wiki page. It's a chapter in the book, and it tells you all the nitty-gritty details about our Python modules, how to create filters, how to create images, how to write animations, and so forth. In practice, I wouldn't do that first right away. That's how I learned it, but I wouldn't recommend you doing that these days. Instead, I'd say start up the Python shell within ParaView. What you'll get there within the Python shell is you'll get tab completion. So you can use dir and help and tab completion, and you can find out what are the parameters of anything you might be trying to do within ParaView. And even better, start the trace feature. So this is a mechanism in ParaView. You turn on the GUI, say start tracing, and then you continue to use the GUI. And anything you do within the GUI, once you say stop trace, it's going to be recorded as a Python script. So I'll demonstrate those quickly. This is the ParaView interface, and I can do arbitrary things here. I can create a simple visualization pipeline, do all the things you might expect out of it. And if I want to figure out how to do the same thing within Python, I could go to the Python shell and say help, of course. Okay, so I can get all the help browsable through here. And more importantly, if I'm trying things here, I can say, if I have tab completion, it will give me all of the possible answers I might want. So it's a really convenient method for figuring out how to use ParaView's Python scripting. I should point out on the wiki page I pointed to about the details of Python, we've got instructions for what libraries and what Python modules you have to have in your path to use the same interface within like an idle or something like that. So you don't have to use it within the GUI. You can, if you have your paths set appropriately, you can use this from any Python that you have. You get the same look and feel. I'll say get active source, and then print. I can, the point is that I can hit tab and then do arbitrary things here. So this is one way to learn to use the ParaView's Python. A much better way, I think, is to use the Python trace. So go to the Tools menu, say Start Trace, and then I will make the same pipeline, stop trace. Now I have, this is the Python script which does the exact same things I did in GUI. So this is the way I would recommend going about, these two mechanisms are the way I'd go about learning ParaView's Python interface. I should also note that once you look at these, the look and feel is very much similar to what you do in the GUI. In one case, I went to the Sources menu and said make a wavelet. Within my Python script, the very first thing I said is make a wavelet. And then I set some display parameters of it, which ParaView, the GUI, did behind the scenes. But then I made a slice filter. So the exact same metaphors I use when I'm using the GUI, I'm creating a visualization pipeline. That's the exact same type of interface I have from this ParaView Python scripting interface. I can save this, save it as a macro, which will show up in the GUI and so forth. I would generally save this somewhere in this. And then this will show up, and then I can play this back through PV batch and so forth. So in any case, here are the different ways to learn ParaView's scripting interface. So some other tips for visualization on HPC sites. Off-screen rendering is somewhere between useful and essential. On the big machines, the Blue Jeans and Crays and so forth, even I was surprised to learn even the XT7s, which all have GPUs in them, they still don't have X running on them. So you can't use these GPUs as as graphics cards, you might think. So even in those situations, off-screen rendering is really important. The easiest way to use it is to build Mesa, which is a software implementation of OpenGL, and make sure that you build the OS Mesa variant of that, and then link ParaView into that. Again, in the ParaView book, which is sourced from the wiki, there's the descriptions of what configurations options you should have for both Mesa and ParaView to set this up. If you do have, if the cluster is set up properly, like Eureka and Tukey seem to be, but Lens does not, unfortunately, you can of course use on-screen rendering and just build ParaView as normal, link to the OpenGL you have on the system. As long as there is an X display somewhere, even if it doesn't have a display, we can create context and do all the rendering we need on screen, which means on the GPU. Other things that you might have to do are, particularly for these cross-compilation builds, we are heavily dependent on Python, so you have to take care that your Python home and path are set to the version of Python that you want to use and the Python modules that ParaView built. This is how I've done it on Titan before. The syntax varies between all the different HPC systems, which makes HPC so fun. And if in the ideal situation where the system has been, ParaView has been built and installed by the sysadmin, should just use something like soft add ParaView or module load ParaView, and then you get all the same goodies. You don't have to do it by hand. Okay, so the different ways you might use ParaView on these big systems. I alluded to before 2 different modes where we had the client connected to the parallel server and the parallel server just running all in batch mode. These are the 2 different modes that you might go about using ParaView on. For an interactive session, I generally use, when I'm first setting up something and trying things out, I use something like Q sub I or Q sub -I to reserve some set of the compute nodes or service nodes. And then once I have them, I can just AP run or MPI run PV batch and then some Python script, which I've recorded from the GUI, and I'll get my images out of them. More usually, after you've figured out how things work, how the system's set up, you just run it as an unattended session, and then you'll just set up QSub, and you don't have the interactive prompt there. Difference here is if I'm doing something interactive, I don't want to have, it's reasonable to use 16 nodes, but if I'm using 1600 nodes or more, then I don't want to have an interactive login. I'll probably get kicked off the system if I try that anyway. So the interactive sessions are generally useful for small problem sizes, just getting the feel of the system and setting up your visualization. But in practice, you generally use off-screen and pure batch processing afterwards. With that in mind, just briefly talk about Catalyst. I said this is one of the directions that ParaView 4 started, major directions that VTK and ParaView went into for ParaView 4. Behind the scenes, what we've done is really just shuffle directories around and improve the CMake lists MakeFileMaker scripts so that you can choose from a much smaller set of VTK and ParaView. Before, with VTK 5.10, you really only had a choice of 5 or 6 different large libraries you could turn on or off. So in practice, VTK and ParaView turned out to be these 500 megabyte libraries that no self-respecting simulation scientist would link into their code. So we reshuffled VTK and ParaView to have a much finer granularity of which portions of VTK and ParaView you can turn on. And the whole goal of that was to make it so that it's feasible for someone outside of Kitware to link VTK and ParaView into the simulation code. So traditional visualization work like this, where you have a simulation which is running things and then it's dumping out periodically some data to disk. And then later on, you use Visit or ParaView or Insight or whatever you have at hand to load it up off the disk, probably on a different cluster, and then look at the results. And as the simulation sizes grow, the disks are getting slower and slower. So these days, it can take 10 minutes or so to dump out the data files from your simulation. So you have, during that 10 minutes where you're dumping out these high-resolution data to disk, you have hundreds or tens or hundreds of thousands of nodes which are just sitting idle, where you have 10 or 100 of them dumping to disk. So as data gets bigger, that's becoming infeasible now. So our solution with Catalyst is that ParaView, VTK Catalyst, whatever you call it, is either directly linked into the simulation, and that's dumping out small amounts, small extracts of the data, just images, or just the surface. You don't have to just dump out all the fields. You can just dump out the surface, and then you can see what the data is doing. Okay, and you can dump out these extracts on every simulation time step, or every 10th, or whatever you have. Or you can have another mode of running this is where you have Catalyst running outside the data. So what you see, this is a simulation from Ken Moreland and Philippe Pibet et al. From Sandia. This is a version of a simulation where it's doing traditional, dumping the data whenever it can, every thousandth time step or something like that. And you see this as these large discontinuities in the temporal dimension. But with in situ processing, because we're just dumping these extracts, you can dump them all the time. So you get a much more fluid data. You know what's happening in between the 10,000 time steps that you otherwise miss. So you get much prettier animations is one aspect of this. But the thing to note is that you're seeing all of the data in the time domain. So we're not just arbitrarily throwing away most of our data. We're seeing at least representative images of most of it, of all of it. So again, I said I was talking about the different modes of running ParaView. There's I said you could reserve an interactive job and then run batch processing. That's not really interactive. We have the same setup as Visit does, where you can connect your client to a server and then run it interactively. And I find this important when I'm first looking at a new data file. So I have some simulation result. I'm doing exploratory visualization. This is incredibly useful. When I'm making my publication images, I'll generally run a batch script. But when I'm just trying to figure out what the heck the data looks like, I'll usually use pure interactive modes here. So within ParaView, there is a file connect button, which you'll see here is 2 machines connecting to each other. And when you click on that, it'll open up a dialog which says, which server would you like it to connect to? And then if you can add a new server and then set up the configuration. And then once you do that, once you've established a connection the first time, you can always just connect to that same server. Different things you might see here when you're establishing, I'll demonstrate here. It's better than going through the slide. Okay, so if I have ParaView running here, this area you see here is the visualization window. It's one of the various view types we can have. And ParaView, other ones include spreadsheet view, where I'm looking at all the data getting streamed in appropriately and so forth. Lots of different view types. Over here, I have the data processing portion of the pipeline, and the data within the pipeline browser tab. And it's saying right here is that my data processing pipeline consists of a wavelet generating source followed by a slice filter, both of which are homed on the built-in server. So that is, I'm connected to the server, which is within my same process that the Qt client is running. I can disconnect from the built-in server, throw away my pipeline, or I can connect, and then I can do things with here, did that a little quickly. So I can go to File and say Connect, or take the shortcut, which you see here. There, the ParaView is full of these shortcuts. Once you get the feel of it, the shortcuts are easier, but they can be confusing when you see all this mass of icons there. Just know that all the icons are shortcuts, something you can find elsewhere. So in any case, when I go to connect, I can say add a server, make up a name for this. I'm calling it creatively localhost. It's going to connect to the IP address localhost on the port 1111, and the connection type is going to be a client-server connection. Different things, options you see here for the server type are the data server render server. This is the split parallel processing mode I talked about early in the configuration, where we have an MPI parallel data processing and a separate MPI parallel rendering engine. That's what these two are for. And the variant of the reverse connection says, is the client going to connect to the processing engine, or is the processing engine going to connect back to the client? So basically, which one is going to open up the socket with a listen and who isn't? Okay. Once I configure one of these guys, I have another option if the startup type is going to be manual or command. Manual says someone else took over the responsibility of starting up the server job. Command lets me type in some command here, and I can say something arbitrary like SSH to localhost and run something like that. So I can type in some arbitrary command which is going to connect me to the machine I'm going to run the server on and spawn the ParaView server job. Okay. So I might SSH here. I might run an MPI exec or an MPI run, something like that. Just arbitrary commands here. ParaView is just going to spawn a process. That process is going to run whatever script I have here, or fire off whatever executable I have there, and then wait for this to come back. Okay. So that's how I establish new connections. Another way of doing it is to fetch servers. This is a new feature based in ParaView 3.14, I think. I can go and type in a URL of some arbitrary site which has posts the ParaView server connection information. So the same configuration I said here about connecting to the IP address of localhost on port 111. All these are saved in XML files, so I can just open up within ParaView some web connection to something which has a listing of these. And then once I do that, I get a list of all of the server configuration files which are listed here, and I can choose from among them and import them. And then once I do, I can just click on them and open up the connection. So if I run this and I spawn this guy and everything is set up right, I can hopefully not type my password. And then that will go and so my connection here, what the connection command said here was to run an xterm within the xterm-e SSH, SSH, and then within that SSH connection, open up an xterm, and then within that xterm, I run some complicated shell script, which goes ahead and reserves a job, and within that job, it runs MPI and tells ParaView, start the ParaView server and connect back through some sockets it connects and so forth. You shouldn't have to deal with any of those if Kitware and the sysadmins have done their job. They'll have established these connections. So you just point ParaView to some page which has a server.pvsc, and then you just click on connect. And then once the job comes back, and so these are the different options I have in my server configuration. I'm saying spawn SSH and then connect to this machine, this username, this port. Made up an arbitrary port to reserve on the server. How many nodes am I going to reserve? How many minutes? What account? Okay, so now I'm connected. And now on the pipeline browser, I see that I'm connected not to the built-in server, but to this arbitrary named here, which is running on Eureka. And I can tell because when I go to File, Open, I am seeing the file system on Eureka, not my file system running on the local system here. And I can open up some toy data sets. The one that looks nice and we use in all our tutorials, and it's known to work pretty well. And then I can set up my visualization pipeline as before. And now I'm doing the data processing and some of the rendering on the server side. So here I'm connected to this data set. Make a streamline filter in here. And then, so now I have a streamline visualization here that's going on. So all the data processing is being done on Eureka in this instance. Okay. What else did I want to say about this? Okay, so when you connect, there's a different arcana about how to connect. And if you look closely at the slides, or if you look at the ParaView webinar I gave on this topic pretty recently, I go through examples of building up some of the connection scripts that you might have. But in practice, all the hard work should have been done for you, either by Kitware or by the sysadmins, or ideally both together. Some of the things that goes on behind the scenes, Hank alluded to this. There's a lot of tunneling that goes on. So we have to establish a TCP connection from the client all the way to the compute nodes, which is kind of tricky because you don't know what the IPs of the compute nodes are, and they're generally behind a couple of firewalls. So the scripts can be kind of annoying to set up. And they have to change every time the system gets an upgrade, but the connection scripts generally start up a bunch of tunnels in between the client that you're running on, the login node, sometimes between the login node and the service node, and then between the service node and the compute nodes that you've reserved. So when you're running in client-server mode, as I said, the file open gives you you're browsing the file system of the remote system you're connected to, wherever the data server engine is. That's really important. Even when the data isn't really high resolution, the data always stays where it is. That's really important for some low resolution but high temporal resolution data, which exist on remote systems. So I've worked with some climate simulation data where just to FTP from the data transfer node on one HPC site to the other took 8 days. So it's really important when you're working with high resolution data to leave the data wherever it is. So this client server aspect of it is a really underappreciated aspect of any of these tools. The fact that they do data parallel processing for high resolution data is sometimes immaterial compared to this remote client server aspect of them. So the big data stays where it is. Visualization in this mode works because visualization usually makes a subset of the data. For one moment in time, you're looking at the surface, something like that. In any case, you're just making pixels, so you're limited to about the data transfer of a movie, which is possible anywhere on the planet these days. So it's very important that you run the client on your own machine, not on the login mode. The login nodes on any of these HPC systems are really just there. They're just expensive typewriters, basically. They just exist so you can run qsub. Qsub this, qsub that, qsub that. So they have really low resources on these things, and that they're shared between everyone who has access to this HPC system. So you should almost never, run ParaView on the login node. It's possible. You can set up X forwarding and things like that, but it's really discouraged. The sysadmins don't like it, and it'll just run really slowly. So don't do that. X forwarding is always bad. If you're not careful, you're going to have a parallel job with 10,000 processors, all of which are trying to display on your local machine over TCP connections over the whole planet. So that's a bad thing. You want the rendering to stay remote, the data to stay remote, and then just send whatever you can over this client-server connection. VNC sessions are generally pretty good. Until recently, they perform about as good as ParaView's own native image delivery systems would. So their VNC sessions can be okay. If the sysadmins have set up VNC, like they have a TAC, it's a reasonably good solution. You don't have to. It avoids the complexity of setting up this tunnel between the client and the server. So VNC is good. Recent versions of ParaView have better compression than VNC because we're specialized for our particular uses. So the strategy is let ParaView take care of the image delivery or data delivery, or however you say. Different things you'll see in ParaView with our settings, which you use to control where the rendering is done. Under the preferences, you'll think under preferences or settings, depending on the operating system you're running the client on. You go to render view in general, there's use immediate mode rendering as opposed to using display lists. When you're working with big data, you should always use immediate mode rendering. Display lists don't scale to large numbers of triangles. So make sure you have that turned off or you turned on. Another setting you'll see is the remote render threshold. So on visualization produce a subset of the data. At some point, it's infeasible to transfer just that subset over the network to the client, and it's better to do the rendering on the remote side and just send pixels. So this setting, the remote render threshold, controls when the server side is responsible for the rendering versus when the client side is responsible for the rendering. I think Hank talks something about that. And there are other things you can see under the client server parameter. Under the parameters presets, there are different compression modes and things like that, which I recommend you use the preset corresponding to your particular situation. If you're sitting here at Argonne, you should use one preset setting if you're running on Argonne's HPC systems. If you're running somewhere else, you should use a slower connection with more aggressive image compression. And as Hank talked about, we both use the ICE-T image compression library developed by Ken Moreland from Sandia. And it does the job of depth compositing. So we have data parallel processing. Every node in the HPC system has a visualization pipeline producing images of some different portion of the data. Here I've got two nodes. One of them is doing the blue part of the sphere, and one of them is doing the red part of the sphere. Each of these is rendering all the pixels and keeping the depth information. And then these are combined with an ICE-T such that you only see the colors from the pixels which are nearest globally across all of the rendering images. So ICE-T is very good at that. It's a 10-year-old algorithm now, and it's still one of the faster image compositing libraries out there. So we've stuck with it. The other nice feature that ICE-T gives you is that it lets you drive tile display walls pretty well. So you can start ParaView's server, a parallel server with -TDX and -TDY options if you're driving a high-resolution tile display or cave display. There are options like that. Control that too. And then while you're interacting with ParaView in a client-server setting, we go through two modes of downsampling, such that whenever you move the camera, the response time should be very quick. So we do both world space, data space, and pixel space downsampling. These, again, are controlled just like the server-side versus client-side rendering threshold was set under the preferences. There are preferences which say, how finely should I break up space? Or how small should I compress the pixels when I'm working in client-server with remote rendering mode? So under the edit settings general, there's an LOD threshold which says controls our world space decompression or compression, which uses Lidstrom's quadrant clustering algorithm. I'll see if I can demonstrate that here. So if I have a wavelet and apply, and then say surface with edges, and then run data here. Under Mac, it's ParaView preferences. Under render view, LOD threshold. I can make this small. And then anytime I interact with the data, you can see the image looks wrong while I'm moving the camera because I'm doing a world space downsampling with the quadrant clustering algorithm so that we don't have as much data to render on the server side. So that's the aspect that you'll see here. Whenever you're moving the camera, that's the explanation for it. Under the preferences, you can set it high if your graphics card locally is suitable for whatever resolution data you have there. And the other type is image-based downsampling. So if I'm running in client-server mode and the server is doing the rendering, all of the pixels have to be sent from the server to the client. And what the image-based downsampling does is just say, okay, give me every 10th pixel, and then on the client expand all these pixels so that all these values to by 10 by 10. So I see the same size of image, but it looks noticeably aliased. So both of those are under the preferences. Where you can go to learn more about ParaView, ParaView.org it's the master website of all our wiki pages and documentation. Things that you might find there are the wiki page, which are since ParaView 3.10, the ParaView guide has been hosted under the wiki. So we invite contributions from anyone who has insights into how you use ParaView or so forth to contribute to the wiki, and then we'll wrap that up into the next version of the ParaView book. There are links to how to sign up and search the mailing list. The mailing list is very active. We get something like 30 to 60 emails a day on that between the ParaView developers and ParaView users mailing list. So that's this is the primary place I'd say people should go when they're trying to learn ParaView or have a question about ParaView. Try the mailing list first. There is a feature called User Voice. Of course, we have a bug tracker for if you find bugs, you can enter bugs. We also have a feature called User Voice, which you can find in the Tell Us What You Think link under ParaView.org, where you can ask for particular features. And then if we find that enough people are asking for the same thing, we'll try to steer ParaView's development in that direction. Most recently, that happened when the highest asked for feature was vector format output, so direct rendering to PDF or SVG or LaTeX PostScript for publication use. Enough people asked on User Voice, and eventually we found funding and directed the development of ParaView. So the ParaView 4 now has vector format output and so forth in it. So you can ask there. You can also ask on the mailing list. You can ask through ParaView support if you have a direct need. Like I said, we try to foster these open source communities and then collaborate on the development of ParaView and all VTK, CMake, and all of our products. So if you have a real need, talk to us at Kitware, and we'd be glad to collaborate with you. And it generally benefits both parties because we have in-depth knowledge of how these things work and how to use them, and we can make you faster, so thus save you time. So that's all I had for the Introduction to ParaView HPC session. Later this evening, if you want, I can take you through examples of how to use ParaView. I'll help you set up connections between your laptop and Eureka. I have running Eureka I have running under Tukey. I have batch processing set up properly, but I don't have the interactive connection that I demonstrated here working right now. I have a build on Intrepid, which I haven't tested yet. It worked in the past, but I haven't tested it recently. And I have yet to build on Mira. But in any of these things, I'm glad to sit down with you, and we can try to get them working. My plan was to go through these exercises, and after you get through all of these, you'll have enough background to start using ParaView on these systems. So thanks. If there are any questions, I can take them.